Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Star Trek, the one from 2013, for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a third-person shooter by Digital Extremes and published by Namco Bandai Games in April of 2013, and it's interesting mostly for the fact that this ties in with the canon, oddly enough, of the new Star Trek films, the ones that J.J. Abrams has been doing. So it's actually set between the Star Trek 2009 reboot and Star Trek Into Darkness. Now, I actually have not seen Into Darkness yet as I'm recording this review, but I actually rather enjoyed the 2009 reboot. I mean, it wasn't really proper Star Trek or anything like that, but it was a fun action-adventure sci-fi flick, and it worked out pretty well for itself. And I do actually have some prior experience with Star Trek games, namely, I played Elite Force 2 back in the day. Now, I never completed it because I only had the demo, but it was actually a pretty good game. So I wasn't entirely against the idea of a Star Trek shooter game. That said, the game did receive some pretty negative reviews when it came out, and a lot of these were centered around the fact that the game is kind of buggy as hell. As in, on launch, there were events that just wouldn't trigger. The co-op on PC didn't work at all at launch. So it was just a complete mess when it came out in terms of the technical problems and everything like that. And a lot of people described it as just a by-the-numbers shooter. So the ultimate question is, did they fix the glaring bugs and glitches that the game had, and more importantly, how is it as a game? Is it what people say it is, or is it better or worse, or what? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it runs on Digital Extremes' proprietary engine, which has also powered Dark Sector, The Darkness 2, and Warframe. And it's a pretty ugly game, frankly. The texture work is downright awful. The lip syncing is horrible in this game. Their mouths do not match what they're saying at all.
Right. If we were to fail in our pursuit, Starfleet would know nothing of our fate.
Which admittedly is kind of amusing, but at the same time it's kind of jarring, and there's a lot of just various bugs and glitches with the visuals that will just really throw you off. Things like floating characters, things like the characters running in place while floating, things like characters getting stuck in a loop where they'll just go around in circles, all kinds of things like that, as well as tons of clipping errors where, for example, you can just walk straight through your co-op partner, whether you're playing as Spock or Kirk. You can just walk right through Spock or Kirk, whoever you aren't playing, and you just ghost right through them like it's nothing, and it's really amusing. There's all kinds of other glitches thrown in there as well, so it's all really jarring, and nothing in this game looks good as a result, unfortunately. About the best it really gets is that they have a few relatively alright particle effects, but even those don't look very good either. And then there's the sound design, which almost makes up for that by nature of the voice cast. They got the actual actors to play the roles of the characters. And by that I mean Kirk is voiced by Chris Pine, and Spock is voiced by Zachary Quinto, Uhura's voiced by Zoe Saldana, Scotty's voiced by Simon Pegg, and they actually turn in some pretty decent performances for the most part. I mean, all things considered, with the script being what it is, they work with what they've got, but they do a decent job, and I mean, it's definitely nice to hear Kirk and Spock going back and forth, because that was actually something I really did like about the 2009 Star Trek reboot. They generally got a very good cast together with that, and it carries over into the game to some degree. Again, considering what script they've got, but I'll get to that in a moment. So the voice cast is very well done for the most part, even though occasionally their performances do fall kind of flat, but I'll get to that in a moment. Again, the rest of the sound design is just kind of average. I mean, you've got some pretty decent music for the most part. It sounds like it fits in with this particular Star Trek universe. You've got some decent enough sound effects. I mean, all of the weapons are basically pew-pew lasers, and they sound like pew-pew lasers for the most part. So it ends up working out alright in the game's favor. But even then, the sound effects themselves are not particularly impressive, nor is the music. It's just the voice acting that really elevates this thing. But ultimately, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set after the events of the 2009 Star Trek reboot and before the events of Into Darkness. And you play as either Captain Kirk or Commander Spock. And it actually is meant to be played in co-op, but I'll get to that in a moment. So the basic plot is that you receive a distress call from a space station that is trying to harvest power from a star. And this is where you run into the yet undiscovered in the film universe race known as the Gorn. They're basically giant lizard kind of creatures. And they have a sort of virus that turns crew members of the space station aggressive, and this is something that continues throughout the entire course of the game, really. And so Kirk and Spock basically have to stop them from getting this device that the space station was working on that is known as the Helios device. And it's ultimately a pretty simplistic plot, and there's not a lot of character development throughout the entire course of the game. I mean, all of these characters, except for the ones who are introduced in the game itself, were already introduced years and years and years ago, whether you're talking about the original series or whether you're talking about the 2009 reboot or whatever. They are just established characters. We know who they are, and they act exactly as you would think they would, for the most part anyway, after having seen the 2009 reboot. But the new characters aren't particularly compelling. They're just kind of flat and lifeless. It doesn't help that one of the ones that is with you for the majority of the game is a Vulcan, and if you know anything about Star Trek, you know that the Vulcan are actually kind of boring unless you're talking about Spock. And so, unfortunately, you can't really get attached to any of the characters that are introduced in this game, and as far as I'm aware, they're not part of the movie that followed it, Into Darkness, so they just kind of feel like they're throwaways. And even the characters you already know from the prior movie as well as the prior series aren't particularly compelling in this game, and that's mostly because of the script. The dialogue in this game is just not very good. It is neither very Star Trek-y, and by that I mean, of course, in the vein of the original series or any of the other series for that matter, nor is it very Star Trek 2009-y, and by that I mean relatively realistic and somewhat easy to digest other than the technobabble. And what you end up with is just a script that's really bland and boring. And like I said, the actors did what they could with what they had, and their attempt is admirable, because they managed to save the script to some degree. But it's just not a well-written script at all. It's not interesting, what's going on is not particularly compelling, and you feel like you're just going through the motions toward even the early parts of the game, let alone toward the end. And then, of course, there's the Gorn redesign, where not only are you dealing with the really crappy visuals of this game, but you're also dealing with them all being kind of hilariously stereotypical lizard enemies. And in regards to the gameplay mechanics of it, of course, they have a bunch of different kinds of Gorn. You have your basic infantry, you've got one that just kind of scurries around on the ground and can tackle you. You've got big brutish ones with really powerful weapons that take a lot of hits to go down, etc., etc., so on and so forth. And what you're dealing with in terms of gameplay is a pretty standard third-person cover-based shooter. You move in and out of cover, you pop out of cover, you shoot at things for a bit, you duck back into cover. You have a regenerating shield, but you do not have regenerating health. You need to recharge that at a health station. And they also implement a light bit of tactical gameplay if you're playing it in single player, because if you're playing in co-op, then say you're playing as Kirk, then the other player would be Spock, and vice versa. But obviously in single player you can't really do that, so what they did instead was they added in a tactical element where you can give very, very basic commands to your AI teammate. In my case, Kirk was an idiot. He constantly kept running into things. He kept running around in circles. He got stuck on level geometry. At one point, he got stuck floating in the air, and he just kept running or walking, and it was incredibly amusing. There's been moments where he's just straight up not even noticed an enemy right in front of him. There's been moments where he just outright defies my orders, and by that I mean apparently it didn't actually register in the game's logic and it just didn't do it. All sorts of things like that. Run directly into enemy fire, run right up into their faces and start trying to shoot at them, all kinds of things. But the AI doesn't care because the AI is stupid. Luckily, the enemy AI is about as stupid as the teammate AI is. They are capable of getting into cover and occasionally throwing grenades at you. That's pretty much it. They pretty much just stay in one specific spot once they get into cover, and they'll occasionally poke out to shoot at you from that particular spot. But they never really do a lot of moving around, and this is playing it on a high difficulty too, so that should tell you something. So the enemy AI ends up being incredibly easy to deal with, the only real challenge being that on higher difficulties they do more damage, and you can take fewer hits as a result. That's pretty much it. So to even get a remote bit of challenge out of this thing, you do need to crank the difficulty all the way up, basically. And it just ends up being cheap shots that bring you down. Things like you just got stuck on the cover, or it glitched out, or any number of things like that. And as far as the shooting goes, it's bog standard, unfortunately. You get a primary weapon, which can be anything from a Vulcan pulse gun to various Gorn weapons to the Starfleet phaser rifle, all kinds of things like that. And those all require ammunition, which you can replenish at various points throughout the level, or if the enemy has dropped one, or if you just find one laying on the ground, you can run over it and you'll pick up ammo for it. But your other armament is your just phaser pistol, which has two settings. One of them is stun and the other one is kill. Now, each weapon also has a secondary fire, and depending on what you're using, it can be any number of things. For example, the Vulcan pulse gun actually has a non-lethal secondary fire, whereas the phaser rifle actually has a sort of shield thing that pops up when you hold the fire button down, which is kind of interesting. But generally speaking, one is going to be more of a utility, and the other one is going to be just the primary lethal function of the weapon. And none of the weapons are particularly interesting. Like I said, they're basically pew-pew lasers. And that's what phasers always have been in the Star Trek lore, so it makes sense. But you would think they would try to diversify things a bit, other than just having your standard shooter loadout. You got a burst fire rifle, which is your phaser rifle. You got a fully automatic rifle. You got a shotgun. You got this, that, and the other thing. Just a standard shooter arsenal just thrown into this sort of lore, and they try to make it work. It doesn't always work all that well, unfortunately. I found that whatever got me headshots was what worked the best, and so I just kind of stuck with the phaser rifle once I got access to that, and it worked out alright. And of course I would just switch over to whatever was on the ground if I ran out of ammo for that. I didn't really care, because I'm adaptable like that. But the shooting itself never felt particularly good, and there were instances where I would take damage while even in cover, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it just ended up being a big mess overall. The combat is just incredibly unsatisfying. Now, you do get situations where you're supposed to go non-lethal, and this is usually against humans or Vulcans or something of that nature, where they're being mind-controlled by the Gorn virus or whatever, and you need to stun them with the secondary fire on your phaser pistol or whatever non-lethal weapon you've got, and then you run up to them and press the use key and you will just do a takedown. Now, of course, with Spock, in a lot of cases, you'll do the Vulcan neck pinch, or nerve pinch, whatever it's called in the actual lore. I can't remember what it's called. I just call it the neck pinch. But semantics aside, it's a basic takedown animation, and it takes it a while to complete, actually, which is kind of annoying. But that's about the only thing that's really going to vary up your combat. Otherwise, you're doing pretty standard third-person shooter things. Where they try to throw in some different ideas is in the XP system and the use of the Tricorder. Now, the Tricorder is an incredibly useful device in Star Trek lore, but I'll get to this in a moment. The XP system is kind of funky. Now, it does involve the Tricorder. You can use the Tricorder to scan various things in the game world and get some XP from that. You can scan weapons, enemies, once you've killed them anyway. There are various data logs all over the place that will give you different background on the lore of Star Trek and all that sort of thing. But this will all give you a very, very small amount of XP. You can also get XP from just going in and getting commendations, which are basically side objectives. For example, get through an area without lethally killing anyone directly, as in it'll be okay if a turret does it or something like that, but as long as you don't do it directly yourself, it'll work, and you'll get a few hundred XP for that. So that's going to be your primary source of getting XP in this thing. There's only one really big problem with that. There's basically only a couple of useful upgrades, and once you've got those, you're not going to give a crap about the XP system at all. There's not really much need once you get somebody who can heal people at a distance, and by that I mean you can both heal people and revive them at a distance with the Tricorder. And somebody else gets the ability to overcharge your shields, and then maybe you get something for yourself, like being able to disintegrate enemy corpses to make them not trigger alarms and such like that when enemies spot them, because there is stealth in this game, and it is awful, by the way. Doesn't really work very well, so I just never really bother with it, and it didn't really come to be a problem. But you get things like that, you get other abilities that you can use, but I never really bother with them, and all I really did was give my phaser pistol an upgrade and give Kirk's phaser pistol an upgrade, and that was kinda it. I ask you what the point of including an XP system is when there's only a couple of useful upgrades. Why can you not just unlock those as you go through the game normally? Which you kinda do here, but this is locked behind some bizarre gamey concept that they felt they had to throw in there because it's a modern game and modern games have XP systems apparently. Anyway, the system itself is mostly pointless, so you're not going to bother with it very much. And as far as the Tricorder goes, this is where things get goofy. You use the Tricorder for just about everything in this game. Want to heal someone at a distance? Tricorder. Want to order your squad mate around? Tricorder. Want to open a door at a distance? Tricorder. Want to unlock a door? Tricorder. Want to hack into a terminal so you can actually complete an objective or something like that? Tricorder. Want to open the chute so you can actually move into a vent or something like that? Tricorder. Want to scan the enemy and find out more stuff about them? Tricorder. It gets really tiresome really quickly. And even better, it's easy mode. It highlights where enemies are when you're holding the Tricorder. Now, you can't shoot anything while you got the Tricorder out, but it's just funny. You basically get to see through walls with this Tricorder, and it makes the combat insanely easy because you're like, oh, well, that's where the enemy is. Let me just quickly and easily just pop their head off. Yep, there we go, good to go. And it just gets incredibly ridiculous with regards to the Tricorder. So the two things they tried to throw in there to spice the main gameplay up don't really go anywhere. So what they do aside from that is they throw in a bunch of mini games. Now, none of these are any good. They're basically, once you try to bypass doors or hack into terminals or whatever, you need to go through a very basic minigame, and it's basically always matching. And there is one that reminds me of Tron, the light cycles kind of thing, where it's basically just finding a path to a certain node without crossing the streams over or whatever. And it's insanely easy to do, you don't even care. And apart from that, you've got a couple of basic matching things where you're trying to match a sinusoidal wave. There's one where you're trying to match various types of waves to one another, whether they're just a certain shape or not. And it's really easy to do. And those get tiresome after the very, very first time they show up, and yet the game uses them constantly as if they didn't know any better. And so it becomes incredibly tiring to go through this thing, just because you're constantly going to be assaulted by these stupid mini-games. And then there's things like the space battle, which is hilarious, I have to say. Because when you think Star Trek, you think, oh, the Enterprise is friggin' awesome, which it is. And so they had to include a moment where there was a space battle, right? Because it makes sense. And it's just a rail shooter segment. You get your phasers, you get torpedoes, and you get shields. Now, I'm going to show you my first attempt at this right now. And you might notice something. But I'll just let you watch it and determine it for yourself, just what exactly is going wrong here. If you couldn't exactly figure out what was going on there was a pretty severe glitch where not only were my phasers not working anymore, but the shield button wouldn't work. Yeah, I found that out very, very quickly because I kept failing that mission, and I'm like, what's going on here? So I decided to plug in my gamepad, and suddenly it worked perfectly. Not a single issue. Now, granted, when I went back to go to keyboard and mouse for the on-foot segment that's immediately after that, it went through the whole, oh, well, there's a controller plugged in, therefore we're going to display only Xbox 360 button prompts instead of the PC button prompts that it should have shown, but oh well. I can easily remedy that by simply unplugging the controller again. But it's just sad that there is a sequence in the game that is unplayable on a keyboard and mouse. And not even by nature of the controls just being awkward as hell or anything like that. No. It's because it literally will not work properly unless you have a gamepad plugged in for some reason. I don't even understand it. And so you find the problem I had with this game most of the time. It's glitchy as hell. Constant bugs and glitches that require you to load checkpoints or outright restart missions because it glitched out too badly. And I've had so many instances where the controls were just locking up on me and things like that. Things where the actual level geometry was all messed up and my character got stuck in it or something like that. It just ended up being a complete mess. But at the same time, it was hilariously bad. That's the thing about this game. Oddly enough, I can't get mad at it. Because normally when a game is this level of buggy and this poorly thrown together, this hastily made, badly written, that sort of thing, normally I would get very irritated with it because it feels like it's wasting my time. This game, on the other hand, yes, it's a bad game. It's a very, very bad game. But it's hilarious. It's the hilarious kind of bad. It's the kind of bad where you get your buddies together and you just riff on it all the time. Until you get bored of it and move on to something else anyway. But at least this game is so bad it's funny. Let's put it that way. And honestly, that's actually kind of refreshing, considering I've been playing so many games that are just straight up bad lately. For example, Ghost Recon Future Soldier, or Kane and Lynch, which that's in the future, so just stay tuned for that. But this game was actually kind of a reprieve just because it's so bad it's funny. I mean, you have no reason to buy this game. The co-op itself, I believe, does work now, but I actually don't know a single person who owns this game, as far as I'm aware. And if they do, then the only reason they do is because they got it in the Humble Namco bundle, which is exactly how I got it. So it's one of those kinds of things where you wouldn't in your right mind buy it. But if you, for some reason, end up with a copy, it's might be something you want to look at for a laugh at least. But don't take it seriously. And certainly don't pay much of anything for it. It's not worth buying. But I do have to say, it's pretty amusing Let's Play and stream material. And if nothing else, you might be able to get some schadenfreude out of getting a buddy to play co-op with you or something like that. Or just get your buddies together and riff on it and laugh at how incredibly bad it is. Ultimately though, I give it a 1 out of 5. Thanks for watching.